Have you ever been deeply close to someone only to watch them suddenly become distant, cold, or emotionally unavailable right after a moment of intimacy? And in that silence, you start questioning everything. Did I do something wrong? Was it all real? Why does love feel so confusing with this person? If this feels familiar, then what you are about to understand can completely change the way you see emotional relationships. Because this is not just random behavior. This is a deep psychological pattern that shapes how some people experience closeness, connection, and even intimacy itself. There is a specific emotional style called dismissive avoidance. And before anything else, it is important to understand one thing very clearly. This is not about labeling someone as bad or heartless. In fact, most dismissive avoidant individuals are not lacking emotions. They are actually protecting themselves from emotions that once felt overwhelming, unsafe, or even painful. Think about this for a moment. Human beings are wired for connection, but at the same time, human beings are also wired for survival. And when emotional closeness has been linked to discomfort, pressure, or emotional neglect in early life, the brain learns a powerful lesson. Closeness is not safe. Distance is safer. So instead of leaning into intimacy, the mind builds protection. Instead of saying, I need you, it learns to say, I am fine alone. And instead of staying emotionally open, it quietly shifts into emotional control. This is where the confusion begins for the people who love them, because in the beginning, everything can feel warm, present, even deeply connected. There can be moments of real closeness, real attraction, real emotional bonding. And just when it feels like the connection is growing stronger, something shifts. A distance appears, a silence grows, a withdrawal happens. And the most painful part is not just the distance itself. It is the unpredictability of it. One moment there is emotional presence. The next moment there is emotional absence. And the human mind is not designed to handle inconsistency in emotional bonding. It starts searching for answers. It starts trying to fix itself. It starts overthinking every word, every action, every moment. But here's the truth that most people never hear. This pattern is not about the other person being too much or the partner being not enough. It is about a nervous system that associates closeness with emotional risk. When intimacy reaches a certain depth, the internal alarm system activates, not because danger is real in the present moment, but because the body remembers emotional pain from the past. And when that alarm is triggered, the instinct is not to stay and explore feelings. The instinct is to step back, to disconnect, to regain emotional space. Because in that space, there is a sense of control again, a sense of safety again, even if it comes at the cost of connection. Now, here is where things become even more important to understand. Most people think emotional distance means lack of care, but in dismissive avoidance, distance is often a coping strategy, not a lack of feeling. It is a learned way of saying, if I get too close, I might lose myself. If I depend, I might get hurt. If I open up, I might feel overwhelmed. So, the system chooses the only solution it knows. Step back before it becomes too deep. And this creates a cycle that can feel emotionally exhausting for both sides. One person tries to get closer. The other person unconsciously creates space. One reaches out. The other retreats. And without understanding the psychology behind it, this cycle can feel personal, painful, and deeply confusing. But here is something important. Understanding this pattern is not about excusing behavior. It is about removing confusion, because confusion is what creates emotional suffering. When you do not understand what is happening, your mind starts to fill in the gaps with self-blame, insecurity, and doubt. And that is exactly why this video exists. Because by the end of this, you will not just see behavior, you will see the psychology behind it. You will understand the hidden emotional triggers, the internal conflict, and the exact patterns that shape this attachment style. And more importantly, you will learn how to stop taking it personally and start seeing it clearly. Stay with this until the end, because what comes next will break down the 7 most shocking emotional patterns of dismissive avoidant behavior and the exact triggers behind them. And once you see them clearly, you will never look at emotional distance the same way again. When a person steps back emotionally right after closeness, it is easy to assume they simply do not care. But the truth is far more complex, and it sits deep inside how the mind learns to protect itself over time. To understand this pattern fully, it is necessary to look beyond behavior and focus on the internal system driving it. A dismissive avoidant emotional style is built on one central idea at the unconscious level. Self-reliance equals safety. This is not a conscious decision. It is a conditioning that forms gradually through experiences where emotional needs were not consistently met, acknowledged, or emotionally supported. Over time, the mind adapts by reducing emotional dependency on others, not because connection has no value, but because connection starts to feel uncertain. In early development, every human being looks for emotional responsiveness. When a child expresses vulnerability, they expect comfort, attention, or understanding. But when those responses are inconsistent or emotionally distant, the brain begins to adjust its expectations. It slowly shifts from "I can rely on others" to "I must rely on myself." This shift becomes a silent emotional rule that follows the person into adulthood. What makes this pattern so powerful is that it does not erase the need for connection. Instead, it creates internal tension between wanting closeness and fearing its emotional consequences. So when intimacy begins to grow in adult relationships, two systems activate at the same time. One system seeks bonding, warmth, and connection. The other system senses vulnerability and tries to reduce exposure. This internal conflict does not feel like a thought process. It feels like discomfort, pressure, or sudden emotional heaviness. And when that feeling rises, the mind searches for relief. The fastest relief becomes distance. Emotional space reduces intensity. Less intensity means less vulnerability. Less vulnerability means regained control. This is why emotional withdrawal can appear so sudden. It is not planned. It is reactive. The nervous system detects emotional closeness as a potential loss of control and responds by reducing engagement. From the outside, it looks like indifference. From the inside, it feels like regulation. Another important aspect of this pattern is how emotional expression is processed. Many dismissive avoidant individuals are not disconnected from emotion itself. Instead, they are disconnected from expressing it outwardly. Emotion is often redirected internally, analyzed rather than shared. This creates a strong habit of intellectualizing feelings instead of experiencing them openly with others. For example, instead of saying "I feel hurt," the internal response may shift toward "this situation is not important." Instead of expressing longing, the mind may reframe it as unnecessary dependence. This mental reframing is not dishonesty. It is emotional protection disguised as logic. It helps reduce emotional intensity by converting feelings into neutral reasoning. Over time, this creates a strong association between emotional openness and discomfort. So even positive emotional experiences can become overwhelming if they require sustained vulnerability. The system becomes highly sensitive to emotional intensity, not because it lacks depth, but because depth has been associated with emotional risk. This is also why consistency and closeness can feel more difficult than occasional connection. Short moments of intimacy are manageable. They come and go quickly, allowing emotional balance to remain intact. But sustained closeness requires continuous emotional availability, and that level of openness can trigger the internal warning system. Another layer of this pattern is independence as identity. Many individuals with this attachment style develop a strong identity around being capable, self-sufficient, and emotionally controlled. This identity becomes a source of pride and stability. So anything that challenges it, such as emotional reliance or deep attachment, can feel like a threat to that internal structure. This does not mean they reject love. It means they often struggle with the feeling of needing love, because needing someone can feel like a loss of autonomy. And when autonomy feels tied to emotional safety, dependence becomes emotionally uncomfortable. What is important to understand here is that the mind is not trying to create distance for harm. It is trying to maintain equilibrium. It is constantly balancing two competing needs, connection and self-protection. When these two needs collide, self-protection often takes priority, not because it is more valuable, but because it feels more urgent in the moment. This is where misunderstandings often grow in relationships. One person interprets distance as rejection. The other experiences closeness as pressure. Both are reacting to internal emotional signals, but neither fully understands the other's internal experience. This creates emotional misalignment that feels deeply personal, even though it is rooted in psychological conditioning rather than intention. The most significant part of this pattern is that it is not fixed in stone. It is adaptive. It was learned, and anything learned through adaptation can be understood and gradually reshaped. But the first step is awareness without judgment, because judgment creates resistance, and resistance keeps the pattern hidden. When the internal logic of this emotional style is understood, the behavior stops appearing random. It becomes predictable. And once something becomes predictable, it becomes less emotionally destabilizing. Instead of reacting emotionally to distance, it becomes possible to recognize the trigger behind it. This understanding also shifts the emotional narrative. Instead of interpreting distance as a measure of worth, it becomes clear that it is a reflection of internal regulation. Instead of seeing withdrawal as absence of care, it becomes visible as a response to emotional overload. And this shift in perception is powerful, because emotional pain often comes not from what happens, but from what it is believed to mean. When meaning changes, emotional experience changes. This is why understanding dismissive avoidance is not about labeling people. It is about decoding emotional patterns that otherwise feel unpredictable. And as this deeper layer becomes clearer, the next step is to recognize the specific behavioral patterns that emerge from it, along with the emotional triggers that activate them. Another deeply confusing behavior in dismissive avoidant patterns appears after moments of emotional closeness. Right when the connection feels strong, there can be an unexpected shift into emotional distance. This shift is not random. It follows a specific internal rhythm that is tied to how emotional intensity is processed by the nervous system. To understand this, it is important to see how emotional closeness is experienced internally. For some people, closeness feels like comfort and belonging. For others, it slowly builds internal pressure, not pressure from the partner, but pressure from within. The mind starts to register emotional involvement as something that requires ongoing energy, attention, and openness. If that internal system is not comfortable with sustained vulnerability, it begins to reduce engagement as a form of relief. This is why distance often appears right after connection. It is not the connection itself that causes withdrawal. It is the intensity that follows it. Emotional closeness activates a deeper awareness of attachment, and for a system that values emotional independence, that awareness can feel like a subtle loss of internal balance. At this point, the brain shifts into regulation mode. Regulation does not always look emotional. Sometimes it looks like silence, sometimes it looks like reduced communication, sometimes it looks like emotional flatness. These are not signs of absence of feeling, but signs of reducing emotional load. The goal is to return to a state that feels manageable internally. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this behavior is timing. The withdrawal often happens when the relationship seems to be improving. This creates confusion because it contradicts expectations. In most emotional frameworks, closeness should lead to more closeness. But in this pattern, closeness can trigger internal alarms that signal this is becoming too much. The mind then prioritizes space. Space reduces emotional stimulation. Reduced stimulation brings a sense of control. Control restores internal stability. This cycle becomes automatic over time. It does not require conscious decision-making. It happens as a reflex based on emotional thresholds. Another important element is how emotional memory influences current reactions. Past experiences of emotional pressure or unmet emotional needs can leave behind internal sensitivity. This sensitivity does not disappear with time. Instead, it becomes part of the emotional processing system. So even neutral or positive closeness can sometimes activate old emotional responses. This is why emotional reactions can feel disproportionate to the situation. The present moment is not the only factor being processed. Past emotional imprints also contribute to the intensity of the response. The result is a reaction that feels disconnected from current reality but is deeply connected to past emotional conditioning. In many cases, the withdrawal is not about rejecting the partner. It is about regulating the self. The internal question is not, do I want this person, but rather, can I handle this level of emotional closeness right now? When the answer feels uncertain, distance becomes the default response. This pattern also connects strongly to emotional pacing. Emotional pacing refers to how quickly or slowly intimacy develops. When emotional connection grows faster than the internal system can comfortably process, it creates internal imbalance. The mind then attempts to slow things down through withdrawal. From an external perspective, this slowing down can appear like inconsistency. From an internal perspective, it feels like recalibration. The emotional system is trying to restore a speed that feels safe. Not too fast, not too intense, just enough to remain in control. Another layer of this behavior is the discomfort with emotional expectations. Even subtle expectations, such as regular communication or emotional responsiveness, can feel like pressure if the internal system is already operating near its emotional limit. This is not because expectations are unreasonable, but because emotional bandwidth is already being used to manage closeness itself. When this limit is reached, the system responds by reducing availability. This is not an intentional withdrawal. It is an automatic adjustment to reduce internal strain. The goal is emotional breathing room, not emotional rejection. Over time, this pattern creates a cycle where closeness and distance alternate. The alternation is not chaotic from an internal perspective. It follows a predictable emotional rhythm. Connection increases internal load, load creates discomfort, discomfort triggers withdrawal, withdrawal restores balance, and balance allows reconnection again. This cycle can repeat many times without conscious awareness. Each phase serves a regulatory purpose. However, for the partner on the receiving end, it can feel unpredictable and emotionally destabilizing. The lack of explanation makes the pattern even harder to interpret. It is also important to recognize how emotional self-image plays a role in this process. Many individuals with this pattern see themselves as emotionally independent. This self-image provides stability and identity, but when emotional closeness begins to challenge that image, internal discomfort increases. The system then reinforces independence through distance, reinforcing the original identity structure. This creates a feedback loop. Independence is valued. Closeness challenges independence. Distance restores independence. Over time, this loop becomes automatic and self-reinforcing. It does not require intention. It becomes a learned emotional pathway. What makes this pattern particularly complex is that it is not experienced as rejection from the inside. It is experienced as self-regulation. There is often no emotional narrative of "I am pushing someone away." Instead, the experience is more subtle, like "I need space," or "I feel overwhelmed." These internal signals guide behavior without emotional labeling. This distinction is critical for understanding the behavior without misinterpreting it. The actions may look similar to disinterest, but the internal experience is centered around emotional management rather than emotional absence. As awareness of this pattern deepens, it becomes possible to see that emotional distance is not a single meaning event. It is a response built from multiple layers: emotional memory, internal sensitivity, identity protection, and nervous system regulation. Each layer contributes to the final behavior, and once these layers are visible, the pattern stops appearing as personal rejection and starts appearing as emotional architecture. This understanding creates space for clarity, which is essential before moving into the next layer of behavior patterns and triggers that shape this emotional style even further. One of the most misunderstood emotional reactions in dismissive avoidant behavior is silence after intimacy. This silence is often interpreted as indifference, but in reality, it is part of a deeper emotional recalibration process that happens internally when feelings become too concentrated. When emotional connection reaches a certain level of depth, the internal system begins to process more information than usual. Thoughts, sensations, memories, and subtle emotional signals all activate at once. For a person whose emotional framework is sensitive to intensity, this internal activation can feel overwhelming. The result is not emotional shutdown, but emotional reduction. Silence becomes the safest form of reduction. By limiting communication, the mind reduces external stimulation. Less interaction means fewer emotional inputs to process. This creates space for internal stability to return. What looks like detachment from the outside is actually an attempt to regain emotional order on the inside. Another important factor is emotional processing speed. Not all individuals process emotional experiences in real time. Some require distance to fully understand what they feel. In these cases, immediate expression of emotion can feel confusing or incomplete. So instead of reacting outwardly, the system turns inward to organize the experience. During this inward phase, external communication naturally decreases. It is not used as a message of rejection. It is used as a pause in emotional processing. The silence is not empty. It is active internal sorting of emotional input. This internal sorting involves separating feelings from intensity. When emotions are strong, they are harder to interpret clearly. The mind attempts to reduce intensity first before assigning meaning. That is why emotional expression is often delayed. Meaning cannot be formed until intensity is reduced to a manageable level. In relationships, this delay is often misunderstood. The partner may expect immediate emotional responsiveness after closeness. But for the dismissive avoidant system, immediate response may feel overwhelming rather than comforting. The need is not to ignore connection, but to regulate emotional load before re-engaging. Another key aspect of this pattern is sensory emotional saturation. Emotional experiences are not only cognitive, they also involve physiological responses. Heart rate changes, nervous tension, and internal alertness can increase during emotionally intense moments. When this saturation reaches a threshold, the body instinctively seeks recovery. Recovery often requires withdrawal from emotionally charged interaction. This is similar to how overstimulation in any form requires rest. The nervous system cannot remain at high activation for long periods without balance. Silence provides that balance by lowering emotional stimulation. However, this silence can create confusion for the partner because the emotional shift is not explained. Without explanation, the mind naturally fills the gap with assumptions. These assumptions often lean toward rejection or loss of interest, even when that is not the internal reality. This misinterpretation is one of the main sources of emotional tension in such dynamics. The behavior is neutral in intention, but negative in perception. The difference between intention and perception creates emotional distance on both sides. Another layer to understand is emotional compartmentalization. Some individuals separate emotional experiences into distinct internal categories. One part of the mind may experience connection, while another part processes safety concerns. These parts do not always communicate smoothly. When safety concerns become dominant, expressive behavior decreases. This does not mean emotional absence. It means emotional prioritization. Safety signals temporarily override expression signals. The system focuses on internal balance before external connection. There is also a strong connection between emotional silence and self-protection of identity. When emotional intensity rises, it can challenge internal self-concept. If someone identifies strongly with independence and control, emotional closeness may create internal conflict. Silence becomes a way to preserve that identity while processing emotional changes privately. In this state, the person is not rejecting the relationship. They are preserving internal structure while adapting to emotional experience. The silence is a buffer zone between emotional engagement and identity stability. Another important trigger for this pattern is emotional unpredictability. When emotions feel unpredictable, the nervous system increases caution. Silence becomes a way to observe without reacting. It allows emotional distance to create clarity. This observational state helps reduce uncertainty. During silence, the internal system often evaluates emotional safety. It asks subtle questions such as whether the level of closeness feels sustainable, whether emotional intensity is increasing too quickly, or whether personal boundaries are being maintained. These evaluations happen quietly and continuously. Because these evaluations are internal, they are not communicated outwardly. This creates a gap between internal activity and external appearance. To an observer, nothing seems to be happening. But internally, multiple emotional processes are active at once. Over time, silence can become a learned emotional strategy. The mind begins to associate silence with resolution. When emotional overload occurs, silence is used repeatedly because it has previously restored balance. This reinforcement strengthens the pattern. However, the meaning of silence remains misunderstood by others. Without awareness of this internal mechanism, silence is often interpreted as emotional withdrawal from the relationship itself. This interpretation creates emotional distance, even when no intentional distancing is present. It is also important to recognize that silence is not permanent in this pattern. It is cyclical. After internal regulation is complete, emotional availability can return. However, the return may not always be consistent because the cycle is based on emotional thresholds rather than external timelines. Understanding this pattern requires shifting focus from external behavior to internal function. Silence is not absence of connection. It is a phase of emotional processing that allows internal stability to reset after periods of intensity. When this is understood clearly, silence stops being interpreted as rejection and starts being seen as regulation. And with this awareness, the next patterns that shape emotional distance become even more visible, especially how thoughts transform into logic as a defense against emotional vulnerability.